Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richmond here, welcome back to the channel. Today we will have a look at this new TTArtisan 75mm f2 lens. It is an autofocus full frame lens for Sony E and Nikon Z. This is quite an interesting lens because not only this lens has a slightly unusual 75mm focal length, but the price of this lens is only $178, which is really cheap for an autofocus lens with an f2 maximum aperture. So why is this lens so cheap? Does it mean the image quality is just not good at all? Or could the image quality actually be reasonably good and it means this lens is a great bargain? We'll find out in this review. But before we start, I want to let you know that the lens sample I used in this review was sent to me by TTArtisan. I do not have to return the lens sample after I finish this review, but I also have not received any money for this review. And if you have watched some of my previous reviews, you will know that I don't really try to sell you any products. I just want to present you all the results from my tests to help you make your own decision. However, if you want to purchase this lens after watching this review, I do have an affiliated link in the video description below that you can use to support my channel. With the 75mm focal length and the f2 maximum aperture, I was expecting this lens to be a bit big and heavy. But when I received the lens sample, I was a bit surprised by how small this lens is. Look at the size of this lens. It is really quite small. The weight of my Sony E mount sample is 328 grams, which is not bad as the lens construction is very solid. It doesn't feel plasticky at all. The lens comes with a reversible lens hood that clicks on the lens very securely. There isn't any buttons or switches on the lens, but we do have an aperture ring near the lens mount. The aperture ring has clicks and it is 3 clicks per stop, from wide open to the minimum aperture f16. There's also the A position on the aperture ring, so you can switch to it and then control the aperture from the camera instead if you want. The lens has a metal lens mount, but there isn't any USB port on the lens because the rear lens cap that comes with the lens can also be used as a USB dock for firmware update. The front filter thread is 62mm. This is not a weatherproof lens, but I'm not really surprised for a lens that is only $178. While TTArtisan has already released a few other autofocus lenses, but this full-frame 75mm f2 lens is the first autofocus lens from TTArtisan that requires very precise autofocus performance because of its shallow depth of field. And I'm happy to report that the autofocus performance of this lens is pretty good overall. The autofocus operation is pretty quiet. Autofocus speed is not the fastest, but it is still pretty reasonable. Autofocus in video mode also works quite well and is also pretty smooth. However, I noticed if I stop down the lens, then video autofocus performance could struggle a little bit sometimes. Also, the lens has quite a bit of focus breathing as well. So in terms of autofocus performance, I think this lens works pretty well for photo users and also casual video users, but this is not the best choice if you are a professional video shooter. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality, and as usual, let's start with the image sharpness first. For this review, I'm testing it with my Sony A7CR, which has a 61 megapixel sensor. At the maximum aperture f2, if we look at the center of the image, the sharpness is already pretty decent. We can even see a bit of false color, which means the sharpness is very good already at f2. Stopping down the lens would improve the center sharpness a bit, But the changes isn't really big because the lens is already pretty sharp at f2. We reached the maximum sharpness at around f5.6. With the A7CR, diffraction starting to soften the image from f8 onwards. Now let's have a look at the corner. At f2, the corner sharpness is really not bad at all. Definitely exceeds my expectation. The corner image sharpness doesn't really change no matter I focus at the center or corner of the image, which means the lens should have quite minimal amount of field curvature. Stopping down the lens would gradually improve the corner sharpness, but just like the center, the improvement is quite subtle. We'll have a look at the close-up shooting performance now. The minimum focus distance of this lens is 75 cm or approximately 30 inches. The maximum magnification is approximately 0.11 times from my own measurements. This is quite similar to a lot of 85mm prime lenses in the market, which is usually around 0.11 to 0.12 times. The sharpness at f2 when shooting at the minimum focus distance is not bad. It's sharp and definitely very usable. When shooting at maximum aperture, there could be a bit of cat's eye bokeh near the corner of the frame, and I definitely don't mind it at all. Actually, I quite like it, but I also understand cat's eye bokeh is not for everyone. Other than that, bokeh is pretty nice and smooth. It doesn't look distracting at all. I also don't see any onion ring pattern as well. Bokeh balls remains pretty round even when we stop down the lens to f5.6 or so. With the 75mm focal length and the f2 maximum aperture, it's pretty easy to dissolve the background when you are shooting portrait photos. If I enable vignetting correction, the lens has very minimal amount of vignetting even at wide open. And once I stop down to f2.8, then vignetting is virtually not visible. However, when I stop down the lens further, I do see a tiny bit of negative vignetting at the corner of the image. The corners are slightly brighter than the center of the photo. I've reported this issue to TTArtisan and they told me they will try to make some adjustments to the firmware to address this issue. Now, if I disable vignetting correction, vignetting is a lot more noticeable at f2, and without vignetting correction, vignetting is almost gone when I stop down to f4. Let's have a look at this test photo where the sun is behind a roof structure. So it is a very high contrast photo. So if we zoom in the high contrast area, we can see a bit of color fringing. But consider this photo was shot at the maximum aperture with a 61 megapixel camera. The amount of color fringing is really acceptable. And only around this kind of very high contrast area, then I will see a bit of color fringing. My local test photo shot at f2 shows a small amount of color fringing in the background. Look at this brick wall test photo. We can see a bit of pin cushion distortion near the top and bottom edge of the photo. The amount of distortion is the same no matter the lens profile correction is enabled or not. Lens flare performance is quite average with this 75mm lens. When shooting into a strong light source, you will see quite a bit of lens flare. Contrast would also drop a little bit. But this is when there is a really strong light source in front of the camera. For most other photos, lens flare is usually at minimum level. If you like to see some nice sunstars in your photos, you will need to stop down the lens all the way to the minimum aperture. Then you can see some reasonably sharp sunstars in your photo. But even at f11, the sunstars still don't look very sharp at all. So yes, you need to stop down the lens to f16 for sunstars. When I first heard the $178 price, and saw the size of this lens, I was really worried that this lens would be a terrible lens because otherwise, why this lens is so small and so cheap. But after testing this lens, I have to say I'm even more confused. The optical performance of this lens is actually pretty decent. So why do TTArtisan sell this lens at such a low price? I'm not saying the image quality is amazing, but the overall image quality is pretty solid. It is good enough for most people. Actually, to be fair, I think it is more than good enough. And not only that, the build quality of this lens is also pretty decent. It doesn't feel cheap at all, and I really need to say it again, it is a really small 75mm f2 full frame lens. If you are a Sony E or Nikon Z user and you want a budget prime lens for a bit of portrait or even just something a little bit longer than the typical 50mm focal length, then this TTArtisan 75mm f2 autofocus lens is definitely one of the best bargains in the market right now.